I'm just going to mention, last week we mentioned paragraph 662. Basically, what he's saying is that for a reflecting consciousness, it is impossible to think of God as the summum bonum. And I just said witness Las Vegas, but the problem is that in Christianity, we created God as the all-good God, that God has a dark side. And
is that the shadow?
The shadow. Yeah, it's the shadow knows, right?
The shadow.
And actually, people must have known this. I mean, creative people must have been knowing and taking from Jung's writing about the shadow in the 30s, because the shadow radio program,
that's right, yeah,
was in the 30s, and it starts out with the shadow knows, right? Well, the shadow does know. And okay, so anyway, paragraph 663. We'll increment up a little bit more. Paragraph 663. What is clear is that Christ is a numinous figure. The interpretation of him as God or the Son of God is in full accord with this born, suffered, and died in order to save mankind from the wrath to come. All right, so...
That doesn't sound friendly. That doesn't sound friendly.
Well, people were afraid of God, okay, like, with good reason, because Job was getting whipped up on in every way possible, right? And so Christ came to remove the fear of God from mankind. And so what he said was that God is all good. And they put on Satan all the bad stuff. The only problem is that God is everything, and God is omniscient. And so therefore Satan is a part of God.
Can we slide back into the psychology of this, though?
Right.
Because if God's the unconscious, which
right.
is the way I relate to it,
which is the way we're trying to talk about it here. Yeah.
Then the idea that an ego is beginning to develop in these times, and becomes this separation. There's a sense of alienation, which would be terrifying, especially if it were brand new.
Sure.
You haven't, Camus not been around yet.
Right.
All those guys.
That's right.
But you've got that alienation, that separation, and that absolute fear of God, because it's that big something, and you've lost touch with it.
Right. And you didn't know what was coming over the hill.
That is the Jewish definition of hell, is separation from God.
Yeah, and I honestly, I can remember being, afraid that some God image or Satan would come over the hill. I mean, it was part of my evolutionary psychology, because I was raised as a Christian, so I was going to Sunday school and hearing all these stories, and so as a kid you're just saying, oh okay, and you're looking over your shoulder, wonder when this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, even in my 20s, I specifically remember, it was my late 20s, I was out of law school, I was practicing law, but I specifically remember asking my Reformed pastor, what's your image of God? Do you think God is going to come down upon us? And I remember that his answer was total mishmash. Okay, he didn't have an answer for me. This God image is in everyone, and it's affecting everyone in a different way, isn't it, Kelly? I mean, this is what you're seeing with your clients, I presume, where some of them are depressed and something is burdening them, and others might be megalomaniacs, and Well,
Let's don't
and
get political.
I was gonna say.
no, we're not getting political.
Is it-
Psychopaths actually, don't have the ability to understand right from wrong, so, I mean.
Right, okay, so a psychopath can't distinguish between right and wrong. And so that's the unique feature that started to develop in the human psyche about this time, was the differentiation between right and wrong, between good and bad, between good and evil. And it was Jung who's all of a sudden realizing this. Nobody got this because the religions developed up and they had a certain explanation, and that explanation got layered over and layered over and layered over and layered over for a couple thousand years, several thousand years. And so nobody questioned it, right? And it's what Edinger talks about in 1500, God fell out of heaven and into the human psyche, right? And the reason was because our rationality and our science, which is our rationality, started to look up in the sky and say, there's no God up there, okay? And then the guys with the electron microscopes say, there's no Satan down there, right? We're down to the Higgs boson and there's no Satan, right? And
Good job, guys.
right. And so then, but Jung, before even that, more and more science came up since 1500, and it kept punching holes into the religious myths. And so people up to 1500 were just accepting it. They built Chartres in France, right?
Yeah.
Chartres?
Chartres,
I think I might have seen it.
the cathedral.
Oh, okay.
All right, so they built the cathedral in France in the 14th century or something like that. And they took 100 years to build a cathedral in Europe in those days. And only the Turks did it in 5 years, but the Europeans took 100 years. And so they were pouring all their psychic energy
Yes.
into this God that was up there. And then all of a sudden, Copernicus and Galileo say, God isn't up there. But the point about Christ being a numinous figure, paragraph 663, is that human psyche was prepared for this, was looking for this, was looking for a way to actually change the way we think about God. All right. And Yahweh was the Old Testament God, and sometimes I've heard this referred to as the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And humans don't really like, as Jung said, humans don't really like their gods to be unlike humans. They want their gods, their God image, to be like humans, and so they want a good God, okay?
Right.
And so they want a Satan, but the problem is that break was a big problem. So let's get into paragraph 664. Paragraph 664. God's salvationist project, save humanity from God. Right? Save humanity from himself. It is as if the Father were a different God than his Son, which is not the meaning, okay? And so fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, goodness, love, and justice of God, the coincidentia oppositorum. But both the fear and the love of God are justified. Okay, so what Jung is understanding in the 20th century, early 20th century, is that we need to both fear and love God.
Kind of like a parent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's
You're
like a
like a
parent.
little animal.
Right. And as
Right or
as we
wrong.
get along in this in Jungian psychology, Jung wants us to find the God image in each individual
Ah,
and
in each other.
in each individual,
God speaks
sure,
to other
because
people.
Jung wants everybody to find the God image, right? Because that is how we regenerate God. Okay, the idea of the Father and the Son, I get into this a little later, but what does the Son do? The Son regenerates the Father, right? And so the whole idea that's presented of a Father and a Son is about regenerating God. As in paragraph 665, Jung is saying, man does not relish any all too human inconsistencies in his gods. Okay, so he's saying that we don't like inconsistent gods. We want gods to be knowable. Go
There's
ahead.
that
Ben.
perfection and completion thing.
Right, but as we know, perfection leads to a dead end.